When Toni Braxton told the world she was done with Birdman, fans took it at face value. Statement made, story over. But then the headlines flipped, the whispers got louder, and one question refused to die. Why say it's over if it never really was? Toni isn't just any R&B icon. She's the voice you hear when heartbreak needs a soundtrack. Elegant, controlled, private. For years, that same calm wrapped around her love life like armor. She called him Brian. We called him Birdman. Together, they moved like a rumor with a diamond ring, seen just enough to start a frenzy, hidden just enough to keep it burning. Then came the twist. Talk of a split. Talk of a marriage. Talk of a split again. Everyone had a version. None of it felt complete. The timelines didn't line up. The smiles didn't match the silence. It was the kind of story that makes you stop the scroll and ask, wait, what's really going on here? Because the truth isn't always what makes it to the caption. Sometimes it hides in the gaps. The dates that don't add up, the ring that flashes and disappears, the way a couple can be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And if you've watched Toni long enough, you know this. She guards her peace like it's platinum. She'll sing the pain, but she won't hand you the diary. So this isn't about one announcement or one interview. It's about patterns. It's about motive. It's about a love story that doesn't act like one, and a breakup that never quite learned how to leave. Fans wanted a simple reason. The truth gave them a maze. Why call it quits only to circle back? Why frame a split as final when the door never locked? Why do the numbers change while the rumors stay the same? Those aren't accidents. Those are choices. And choices tell you more than statements ever will. Here's what we're going to do. We'll trace the friendship everyone swears by, the timeline nobody can agree on, and the moment the public narrative snapped. We'll look at the money, the mansion talk, the nights that raised eyebrows, and the one detail that keeps pulling this story out of the shadows. Because once you see how the pieces fit, the lie starts to look less like drama and more like strategy. But that wasn't the whole story. Before the rumors, before the diamond ring, Toni Braxton and Birdman swore their story started as nothing more than friendship. "We've been friends for over 25 years, she said in interviews, her tone warm but careful. The kind of statement that sounds rehearsed, like she'd said it a few too many times. But anyone who's been paying attention knows that's where the story starts to crack. Because if you rewind the clock, long before she ever mentioned a 25-year friendship, Birdman was already showing up. Not just as a friend, but as something more. Go back nearly a decade to Braxton family values, and you'll see it clear as day. There he was, sitting comfortably with Toni's family, the kind of presence that doesn't just happen overnight. The chemistry wasn't new, the comfort wasn't new, and the way everyone acted, it wasn't the vibe of a casual friendship that had just turned romantic a few years ago. So why change the story? Why draw a clean line between friendship and romance when that line clearly blurred long ago? Maybe it was image control. Maybe Toni wanted to protect a version of herself that fans were still attached to. The elegant, untouchable diva who lived above industry drama. Admitting she'd been secretly involved with a rap mogul for years might have clashed with the soft, classic brand she'd built since Unbreak My Heart. Birdman, on the other hand, didn't seem to mind. He's always been upfront about the money, the fame, the lifestyle. When asked about Toni, he smiled like a man who already knew where they stood. No mystery, no denial, just quiet confidence. So why was Toni being so careful? That's the question that keeps fans coming back. Maybe it wasn't about lying. Maybe it was about protecting something or someone from too much exposure. When you've lived your life under the spotlight, sometimes rewriting the timeline is the only way to keep people out of the parts that still hurt. And that's what makes this story so compelling. Because when Toni said it got serious only a few years ago, she wasn't just changing a detail, she was changing the narrative. She was telling the world how she wanted it remembered, but that's where things start to twist. Because if you think the timeline is strange now, wait until you hear how the numbers, 17 years, 25 years, 10 years, kept changing over and over again with every new interview she gave, and that inconsistency, that's where the truth starts to slip through the cracks. Every great love story has two sides, but Toni Braxton and Birdman's story, it has three versions, and none of them match. In one interview, Toni swore they'd known each other for 17 years. In another, she said 25. A few months later, she casually mentioned 20. The math didn't just feel fuzzy, it was impossible. The years didn't line up, the timeline didn't make sense, and fans began to wonder, was this just forgetfulness? Or was Toni deliberately rewriting her own history? When you watch her interviews back to back, a pattern emerges. Toni speaks softly, like someone choosing each word carefully, protecting the tone of her story more than the facts. She talks about Birdman as a dear friend, the man who supported her through her shows, her baby shower, even her Broadway run. The story sounds safe, clean, familiar. But if that's true, why does she avoid specific dates? Why does she dodge questions about when friendship became love? Because in celebrity relationships, timing is everything. When you're building a career image as polished and delicate as Toni's, the moment your romance becomes public matters. Too early, and it looks like distraction. Too late, and it looks like deceit. Somewhere along the way, it seems Toni chose to blur those lines entirely, to keep the narrative flexible. And it worked, for a while. But then fans started comparing clips, piecing together old interviews, social media posts, and reality TV appearances. The inconsistencies started to pile up. One moment, she's downplaying the relationship. We were just friends. The next, she's flashing $1 million ring. Even her sisters hinted that the story behind the scenes was very different from what Toni was letting the public believe. Still, she held her ground, calm, controlled, unbothered. She brushed off questions with charm, sometimes even humor, because when you've been famous as long as Toni Braxton, you know exactly how to dodge a headline. But this time, the cracks were showing. Her public image, the mysterious private songstress, was colliding with her real life, a life full of contradictions, secrecy, and quiet choices made off camera. And just when fans thought they finally had the timeline figured out, a bombshell hit the internet. A secret wedding that no one knew had even happened. But that's when everything changed. Because the truth about Toni and Birdman's marriage wasn't just surprising, it was downright confusing. For years, the world thought Toni Braxton and Birdman were just engaged, taking their time, keeping things quiet, doing love their way. Then, seemingly overnight, everything exploded. Reports surfaced that Toni and Birdman had secretly tied the knot. No big ceremony, no media coverage, no red carpet moment, just a quiet date, August 8th. And 2 days later, it was over. Fans were stunned. How do you go from wedding vows to divorce papers in 48 hours? That's not a breakup. That's a plot twist. Leaked court filings showed Toni had submitted, and then quickly dismissed, a petition to end the marriage. It was the kind of paper trail you can't fake, and it painted a picture more complicated than any love song she'd ever sung. So what happened behind the scenes? Some say it was pressure. Birdman, worth over $150 million, lived fast and flashy, the complete opposite of Toni's polished, quiet world. Others believe the marriage wasn't supposed to be public at all, that it was meant to stay hidden until the timing felt right. But the internet doesn't wait for permission. And once the story broke, Toni had to do what she does best: control the narrative. She brushed it off in interviews. Wasn't keeping it a secret. Her tone was firm, almost defensive, like someone tired of being misunderstood. But if it wasn't a secret, why was no one at the wedding? Why did fans only learn about it through leaked documents? That's where the mystery deepens. Maybe it wasn't embarrassment. Maybe it was regret. Maybe those 48 hours were the moment she realized the reality of Birdman's world wasn't something she could live in full-time. Because being Mrs. Birdman came with more than a diamond ring. It came with scrutiny, judgment, and a lifestyle far removed from her own rhythm. And yet, she didn't fully walk away. After the split, the divorce petition quietly disappeared. No official separation, no statement, no closure, just silence. The kind of silence that only raises more questions. Fans wondered if the marriage had ever really ended, or if the divorce story was just another layer of misdirection. Because for all the headlines about heartbreak, Toni and Birdman were still legally married, still connected, still orbiting each other like two planets that couldn't quite break free. So what kept them tied together? Love? Loyalty? Or something much more practical? Because as the dust settled, one detail began to stand out. The money, the houses, and the quiet exchanges that suggested Toni's marriage might not have been built on passion, but on protection. And that's where the story takes its sharpest turn yet. Because what came next would make fans question everything they thought they knew about Toni Braxton's heart and her motives. Money changes everything. And in Toni Braxton's case, it might have changed love itself. By the time her name was linked with Birdman's, Toni wasn't just a legend, she was a survivor. 2 bankruptcies, endless legal battles, and a reputation for luxury that didn't always match her bank balance. She'd sold millions of records, but somehow the math never worked in her favor. The world saw glamour. Toni saw bills, lawyers, and numbers that didn't add up. Enter Birdman, the rap mogul who built Cash Money Records from the ground up, a man whose net worth soared past $150 million. To him, money wasn't a problem. It was a language. And from the outside, it looked like Toni had finally found her financial peace. Reports say he bought her a sprawling home, paid in full, added a Bentley to her driveway, gifted jewelry worth more than most people's yearly income. To fans, it looked like the fairy tale she deserved after years of struggle, but to others, it looked more like a transaction. Because behind the smiles, something didn't fit. They weren't living together. Their public appearances were rare. When they did show up side by side, the chemistry felt distant. Toni glowed on camera, but Birdman looked like a man trying to prove something, not someone basking in mutual affection. People started whispering that this wasn't love. It was logistics. A relationship built on what each person needed most. Birdman got class, credibility, and the prestige of being tied to an R&B legend. Toni got stability, emotional maybe, but certainly financial. And then came her own confession. I filed for divorce because Birdman was too good for me. At first, it sounded humble, even romantic. But the more people listened, the more it sounded like code. Like she was saying, he gave me everything, except what I actually wanted. Still, Toni never framed Birdman as the villain. She called him generous, kind, supportive. But affection? That's where the tone changed. It wasn't warm. It was polite, respectful, but detached. The kind of tone you use when talking about someone who's helped you, not someone who owns your heart. And for Birdman, generosity came easy. He once said he'd make sure she's happy and got money, a statement that sounded more like a promise or a deal than a declaration of love. It painted a picture of two people bound by convenience, by history, by loyalty, but not necessarily by passion. Maybe that's why fans can't let this story go, because deep down it raises a question most people are too scared to ask. What happens when a relationship isn't built on love, but on need? And that question got even louder when Toni skipped the one event that could have silenced all the rumors, the night Birdman needed her most. Because if love is about showing up, Toni Braxton didn't, and that moment told fans more than any interview ever could. When Birdman showed up for the legendary Versus battle, fans expected Toni Braxton to be right there in the front row, the elegant queen beside her king. It was his night, his world, his stage. But when the cameras started rolling, she was nowhere to be seen. No cameo, no post, not even a quiet proud of you on social media. And that silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. The Versus wasn't some small-time performance. It was a moment. A victory lap for a man who'd spent decades shaping hip-hop. Every big name in music was tuned in. Everyone but Toni. And when Birdman's friends started joking about her absence live on air, you could see the discomfort hit him in real time. "Where's Toni?" one of them teased. Birdman laughed it off, but it was that tight, uncomfortable kind of laugh, the one people use when they're trying to shrug off something that actually stings. Toni wasn't sick. She wasn't touring. She wasn't busy. She was home. Fans later learned she'd been sitting comfortably in her house that night, the same house Birdman had reportedly bought for her. That detail hit hard, because if your husband, the man who changed your life, who publicly supports you, who bought your dream home, is having one of the biggest moments of his career, why wouldn't you show up? Theories started flying. Some said it was pride, that Toni didn't want to be seen as the rapper's wife. Others claimed she was making a statement, quietly pulling back to remind the world that she was the star, not the accessory. But to Birdman, loyalty means visibility. To him, presence is love. And her absence didn't just hurt his feelings, it exposed the distance fans had already suspected for years. Even his friends on the live stream couldn't help but notice. They teased him, calling out that big empty space beside him. One even joked, "She at home, bro." And Birdman just nodded, almost like he was admitting defeat without saying a word. That clip went viral, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. You could see the imbalance. A man still showing up, still giving, still hoping, and a woman who'd already checked out emotionally, maybe long before that night. And it's not like Toni didn't know what people would think. She's media savvy. She's been in the industry for decades. If she skipped that event, it wasn't by accident. It was a choice. Maybe it was her quiet protest, or maybe it was her way of confirming what everyone had been whispering. This relationship wasn't built on love anymore. But if Toni had emotionally moved on, why stay? Why keep the marriage intact? The answer, as it turns out, might not be romantic at all, because what kept them together wasn't affection. It was advantage. And that advantage would make everything about their story even more complicated. By this point, even the most loyal fans couldn't ignore the signs. The chemistry that once looked mysterious now looked mechanical. The smiles felt staged, and every new interview from Toni Braxton only deepened the sense that this wasn't a love story anymore. It was an arrangement. Let's call it what it was, a relationship of convenience. Birdman had the power, the wealth, and the influence. Toni had the legacy, the class, and the reputation he'd never quite achieved in his world of tattoos and tough talk. Together, they made an unlikely but powerful image. The beauty and the boss, the R&B goddess, and the hip-hop king. On paper, it worked. But behind the camera, the emotional connection seemed to fade with every passing year. People close to them noticed. Birdman was generous, always making sure Toni had whatever she wanted. Homes, cars, security. But love isn't measured in gifts. It's measured in presence, in energy, in the little things you can't buy. And those, they were missing. Toni herself once said, "Birdman was too good for me." At first glance, it sounded poetic, a woman humbled by a man's love. But listen closer, and it almost feels like she was saying something else. Maybe too good didn't mean kind. Maybe it meant predictable. Maybe she admired him, but didn't want him. Because when you truly love someone, you don't need to hide behind contradictions. You don't need to reword timelines or downplay connections. Yet Toni did, over and over again. She kept the story vague, reshaped it for interviews, softened it for TV. It's as if she wanted the world to know just enough to believe in the fantasy, but never enough to see the truth. For Birdman, that might have been enough. He's a businessman, and in business, loyalty can matter more than passion. Maybe he liked the stability of Toni, the calm after a lifetime of chaos. Maybe he knew what they had wasn't romance, but he didn't care. It was mutual benefit. And in some ways, they both got what they wanted. Toni found security. Birdman found peace. The world saw two icons bridging genres and generations. Proof that opposites attract, even when their hearts don't align. But love built on convenience always leaves cracks, because eventually, one person starts craving something real, something that isn't tied to image or comfort. And from everything we've seen, that person wasn't Birdman. It was Toni. She's the kind of woman who lives between elegance and emotion. She feels deeply, but she hides it well. So when she started pulling away, skipping events, avoiding public appearances, dodging questions, it wasn't just fatigue. It was a quiet exit, the kind you make when your heart has already packed its bags. Still, even after all the distance, they never cut the cord. No messy breakup, no official split, just an ongoing connection that feels more like an understanding than a marriage. And maybe that's the point. Maybe for Toni, Birdman wasn't the love of her life. He was the lesson of her life. But the story doesn't end there, because no matter how careful she was, Toni Braxton couldn't hide forever. The image she fought to protect, the perfect balance of mystery and grace, was about to collide with the truth she'd been trying to manage all along. And when that happened, fans would finally see the side of Toni she never wanted the world to understand, the side that cared more about control than connection. Toni Braxton has built her career on mystery, the slow burn, the subtle smile, the kind of poise that makes you lean in, trying to figure out what she's really thinking. And that same instinct, to stay polished, to stay in control, didn't stop at her music. It defined her personal life too, because for Toni, perception isn't just power, it's protection. She came up in an era where image could make or break a woman's career. Every headline mattered. Every rumor could undo years of work. And after 2 bankruptcies, public heartbreaks, and constant scrutiny over her family's reality show, Toni learned how to survive the only way she knew how, by curating what the world got to see. So when fans questioned her relationship with Birdman, the odd pairing, the conflicting stories, the emotional distance, Toni didn't panic. She adjusted. She reshaped the narrative to fit the version of herself she wanted to protect. Strong, independent, in control. The woman who could survive anything, even love that didn't love her back. In interviews, she kept the tone measured. When rumors surfaced, she smiled through them. When people called the marriage fake, she didn't argue. She simply refocused. She talked about music, her health, her sisters, her skincare routine. It was as if she was saying, "You can speculate about my life, but I decide what's worth talking about." That's Toni's superpower: silence. She doesn't need to clap back. She just lets confusion do the work for her. But here's the thing about silence. It protects you, but it also isolates you. And the more Toni pulled back, the less real her story felt. Fans who once adored her vulnerability started to notice how carefully she avoided emotion. The woman who once sang, "Unbreak My Heart," now spoke like someone who refused to admit it was ever broken. Maybe that's what her lie was really about. Not deceit, not manipulation, but control. Toni wasn't trying to fool the world. She was trying to manage it. She knew that once the public got a hold of her truth, they'd twist it into something uglier than it really was. So she took the wheel, steering the story toward the safer version. And honestly, who could blame her? When you've spent decades being picked apart by tabloids, judged for every choice, and reminded of every failure, you stop telling the truth for validation. You start telling it for survival. That's why the timelines don't match. That's why the emotions don't line up. Because this was never just about Birdman. It was about Toni Braxton's lifelong habit of rewriting pain into poise. To her, image isn't a mask, it's armor. And every contradiction, every vague answer, every perfectly timed silence was part of her defense. But even the strongest armor cracks under enough pressure. And Toni's carefully built facade was starting to show hairline fractures. People were beginning to see the woman behind the legend. The one still trying to heal, still trying to maintain control, even as her story slipped out of her hands. Because the truth about Toni Braxton isn't that she lied to the world. It's that she's been performing survival her entire life. And for a woman who's been through heartbreak, fame, and financial ruin, maybe controlling the narrative isn't deception. Maybe it's the only way she's learned to stay standing. But if that's true, then one final question remains. What's the real cost of protecting your image when the truth is begging to be seen? And the answer to that question might just redefine how we see Toni Braxton forever. After all the years of speculation, the interviews, the whispers, and the contradictions, one truth still floats in the air, unanswered. Why did Toni Braxton lie about divorcing Birdman? Was it shame? Or was it strategy? Because when you look closer, her story doesn't read like deceit. It reads like defense. Toni has lived a lifetime in front of cameras that never stop rolling. Every heartbreak she's had has turned into a headline. Every mistake has been turned into a meme. And when you've lived like that for decades, you stop sharing truth for connection. You share it for control. Maybe she said they were divorcing not because she wanted out, but because she wanted space. Maybe the lie was a way to pause the chaos, to let fans focus on the music, not the man. Maybe it was the only way to reclaim her story without completely burning the bridge she wasn't ready to cross. It's easy to forget that Toni Braxton is a woman who's been both celebrated and scrutinized her entire adult life. The world has seen her at her highest, Grammys, platinum records, magazine covers, and at her lowest, bankruptcy, illness, heartbreak. Through all of it, she's had to remain composed, graceful, Toni Braxton. But behind the velvet voice and calm smile, there's a human being who's had to calculate every public move like it's a chess match. And maybe that's the real tragedy. When you live for so long protecting your brand, your privacy stops feeling like peace. It starts feeling like a cage. Fans want answers. But what if the real answer is that there isn't one? Maybe Toni doesn't even fully know where love ended and strategy began. Maybe Birdman became both her comfort and her caution. The man she trusted enough to marry, but not enough to completely let in. Even today, they're still legally connected, still orbiting each other quietly, even if the romance is long gone. There are no public fights, no dramatic fallouts, just this strange, lingering attachment that refuses to die. It's the kind of ending that doesn't give you closure. It just gives you perspective. Because maybe this story was never about lies or betrayal. Maybe it was about two people trying to survive the spotlight in completely different ways. One through loyalty, the other through control. So when Toni said the marriage was over, maybe it wasn't a lie. Maybe it was wishful thinking. Maybe she wanted to believe she could close that chapter. But some stories, especially the ones written in secrecy, never end cleanly. And that's what keeps the world fascinated. Because for every song she's ever sung about heartbreak, Toni Braxton's real-life love story might be the most complicated ballad of them all. And even now, with the truth half told and half hidden, one thing's clear. She may have tried to end the narrative, but the world isn't done listening. Because the question still hangs heavy, not just for her, but for anyone who's ever chosen image over emotion. Did Toni Braxton lie out of love or out of fear of being unmasked? And until she answers, that question will echo, long after the cameras fade and long after the love songs stop playing. For all the rumors, contradictions, and quiet revelations, one thing about Toni Braxton remains undeniable. She knows how to control a story. Whether it's through lyrics, interviews, or calculated silence, Toni has turned her life into something most people can only dream of, a legend. But legends always come at a price. Behind the perfect lighting and polished tone, there's a woman who's been surviving the weight of her own narrative for decades. From her early career triumphs to public financial battles, Toni has lived every extreme. Adored and doubted, rich and bankrupt, in love and completely alone. So when it comes to Birdman, maybe her truth isn't meant to be clean or linear. Maybe it's meant to be complicated, because that's real. At its core, this isn't just a story about two celebrities. It's a story about what happens when love collides with image, when survival meets vulnerability. Toni once sang, "Unbreak my heart." But maybe this time, she wasn't asking for healing. Maybe she was asking for understanding, for people to see that even icons can be fragile, defensive, and imperfect. Birdman gave her stability. She gave him elegance. Together, they built something that looked like forever, until it didn't. And while the world picked apart their relationship, Toni quietly kept moving, refusing to let anyone define her by who she was standing next to. Because that's who Toni Braxton is. A woman who refuses to be anyone's tragedy, even when the facts don't match, even when love turns into obligation, even when the world demands explanations she'll never give. She remains the same, composed, graceful, and always in control of her silence. So did Toni Braxton really lie to the world? Or did she just tell the story the way she needed to? Trimmed, rearranged, and polished for protection? Maybe the answer isn't in what she said, but in what she didn't. Maybe it's in the spaces between her words, the pauses, the hesitation, the way she looks away when someone mentions Birdman's name. Because the truth about Toni Braxton isn't one confession or one headline. It's a pattern of love, loss, and survival. And that's what makes her story timeless. In the end, Toni's not just the woman who lied about a divorce. She's the woman who rewrote her ending. A woman who learned that peace sometimes costs honesty. A woman who understands that not every secret is meant to be exposed. Some are meant to be lived with. And as the world keeps guessing, Toni Braxton will keep doing what she's always done best. Smiling through the mystery, singing through the pain, and reminding everyone that sometimes protecting your truth means keeping just enough of it to yourself. Because for Toni Braxton, the music, the myth, the mystery, the final note isn't closure, it's control.